My name is Lieutenant William Ashcroft-Toft, and in November 2019, I received deployment orders that felt wrong the moment I saw them. At that time, I was stationed at Fort Bragg, assigned to a specialized logistics unit responsible for equipment and personnel movement for classified operations. It was not a glamorous posting. It was the kind of work you earn after years in the field when command decides your experience is more valuable behind a desk than in the dirt. I had coordinated missions that officially never happened and supported operations that never appeared on any record. Still, these orders were different. They arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered by hand, which was the first sign something was off. Military communications follow systems and accountability. When someone shows up in person with paper, it usually means someone does not want a digital trail. The courier was a civilian in his mid-40s with an unremarkable face and a flat professional voice. He handed me a plain envelope with my name and rank printed in generic type, no insignia, no return address. He said, "Lieutenant Ashcroft-Toft, you are to report to Andrews Air Force Base Monday morning. Transportation has been arranged. Bring cold weather gear and personal effects for extended deployment. Do not discuss this assignment with anyone." Then he left without another word. Inside the envelope was a single page, temporary duty assignment to McMurdo Station, Antarctica for meteorological support. Duration indefinite. Special instructions followed. Report to Building C7. Maintain operational security. The equipment list made my stomach tighten. Alongside standard cold weather gear and survival equipment were encrypted communications devices, satellite systems rated for extreme cold, and tactical hardware that had nothing to do with weather. This was military hardware wearing a scientific mask. I spent the weekend preparing, and the secrecy bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I had worked classified missions before. Those came with briefings and structure. This felt like being erased with paperwork. My wife, Jennifer, noticed immediately. 20 years of marriage teaches you when silence means fear. She watched me pack gear I had not used since Norway 5 years earlier. She asked how long. I told her weeks or longer, and that communication might be limited. She nodded because she understood the language of omission. Antarctica, she said quietly. She was right. I tried the cover story about weather monitoring. She had seen me deploy to combat zones and handle material most people would never know existed. This time she looked more afraid. "Just come back," she said. I promised like soldiers always do, knowing it is a promise we may not keep. Monday came and I flew to Washington, then took a military shuttle to Andrews. Building C7 was windowless and smelled of coffee and fresh paint. 3 others were waiting. Senior Master Sergeant Henry Beaumont was a career soldier with a weathered face and eyes that had learned how to lock memories away. Specialist Elliot Pembroke was younger with nervous energy and soft hands. A radar technician with advanced degrees in atmospheric physics and signal analysis. Petty Officer Samuel Rothwell was Navy logistics with the calm efficiency of someone who notices when supplies do not match the mission. We exchanged names, ranks, specialties, and nothing personal. The briefing officer arrived exactly on time. Major Caldwell, according to his insignia, though something about him felt detached from any normal chain of command. He placed a locked briefcase on the table and said what he was about to tell us was classified at the highest level. The operation officially did not exist. We were not to discuss it with anyone, we all acknowledged. He distributed folders and activated a projector showing Antarctica from orbit. Our destination was a facility called Outpost Meridian, far from McMurdo, in one of the most hostile regions on the continent. Temperatures averaged -40°C, winds exceeded 60 miles per hour. Rescue would be difficult, if not impossible. The image showed a cluster of prefabricated buildings around a central structure. I noticed perimeter towers and said so. Caldwell did not respond and moved on. Enhanced security protocols, he said. Our role was logistics, security, and technical support. Standard tour 6 months. Beaumont asked what research required that level of defense. Caldwell said the specifics were above our clearance and that our job was to ensure uninterrupted operation. Radio communications would be monitored. Personal contact with family limited to approved text. Supplies arrived monthly. Cargo manifests were classified. We were to catalog, not question. Personnel were divided into research and support. Large sections were off limits. Psychological screening was mandatory due to potential mental stress. I wondered what kind of weather caused trauma. After the briefing, we stayed behind reviewing materials. Rothwell noted evacuation protocols were minimal. Pembroke pointed out power requirements far beyond meteorology. Beaumont said this felt different from other black sites. That evening, we prepared for deployment. The flight to New Zealand was long and quiet. The final leg was aboard a C-130 Hercules. No windows. No comfort. The crew chief announced ground temperature -42 with high winds and 10 minutes on the ground. As we descended, I looked through the porthole at endless white. The landing was brutal. The cold hit like a living thing intent on killing you. Facility personnel unloaded us with efficient silence. Through blowing snow, I saw Outpost Meridian, satellite arrays, communications gear, guard towers. The tracked vehicle carried us closer, and that was when I noticed something that would not leave me. The fence angles and tower placements were wrong for defense. They were designed to contain. We were not protecting something from outside. We were keeping something in. Inside, the facility was larger than expected, with corridors extending deep into the ice. Institutional white and gray, exposed pipes. We were met by Dr. Veronica Strand, the administrative director. She spoke with military precision despite civilian credentials. Strict compartmentalization, she said. Research staff full access. Support staff limited zones. Violations meant discipline. Common areas looked normal. Mess hall, recreation room, dormitories. But deeper sections had cameras every 20 feet, biometric locks, reinforced walls, pressure-sealed doors. Our duty stations were logistics. Rothwell reviewed catalog systems. I studied manifests and saw anomalies. Excess electronics, drilling equipment, geophysical scanners capable of penetrating kilometers of ice, biological containment units rated for hazardous materials. Beaumont returned from security rounds unsettled. Armed patrols, motion sensors. This was not weather security. Pembroke reported radar aimed downward, not skyward. Over days, we learned the research staff were not meteorologists. They were geophysicists, archaeologists, xenobiologists, theoretical physicists. They worked in restricted zones and looked exhausted when they surfaced. Dr. James Harriman, the lead researcher, carried obsession in his eyes. Fuel usage figures did not match requirements. Excess fuel vanished. Night operations increased. Equipment moved without inventory. Beaumont confirmed the towers held area denial weapons. Containment, not defense. Pembroke found encrypted channels transmitting terabytes daily to unknown command. By the end of the week, I understood this was not a station. It was an excavation. Something buried beneath the ice required secrecy, biological containment, and military force. And whatever it was, someone believed it must never escape. The longer I stayed at Outpost Meridian, the more the cover story collapsed under its own weight. And every day brought new evidence that whatever we were supporting had nothing to do with weather or atmosphere. The routines settled in quickly because isolation forces rhythm on everyone. Wake, cycle, work, rotation, meals, sleep, repeat. But beneath that routine, there was tension that never eased. I began noticing patterns that did not fit any normal research facility. Research staff moved in shifts that ignored day and night cycles, vanishing into restricted zones for 12 or more hours at a time, and returning hollow-eyed, shaken, sometimes silent. Their conversations stopped when support staff entered a room, and when they did speak, it was clipped and guarded like people afraid of saying the wrong word even to each other. The manifests I reviewed grew stranger by the day. Alongside food, fuel, and medical supplies were repeated deliveries of industrial drilling equipment, heavy-duty boring head seismic sensors, ground-penetrating radar unit. It's capable of mapping deep subsurface structures, and biological containment gear rated for extreme hazard exposure. This was not redundancy or over-preparation. This was escalation. Rothwell noticed it too and confirmed fuel consumption figures that could not be explained by heating or generators alone. Excess fuel was being burned somewhere deep beneath us. Pembroke brought his own concerns after long shifts monitoring systems that were never mentioned in official briefings. He showed me power curves and signal logs indicating deep scanning arrays running continuously and drawing energy at levels comparable to small industrial facilities. These systems were not looking at clouds or wind shear. They were mapping something below the ice. Beaumont confirmed security measures had quietly increased. Additional automated defenses were installed around the perimeter. Internal checkpoints were added. Drills shifted from external threat scenarios to internal containment responses. The language used by security staff changed as well. Instead of perimeter breach, they said internal event. Instead of evacuation, they said isolation. That distinction mattered. One night while performing routine inventory checks, I heard a sound that made me stop breathing. It came from far below the facility. A low vibration that traveled through the floor and into my bones. It was not wind or generators. It was mechanical and rhythmic like heavy machinery operating at depth. When I asked facility management, I was told drilling operations were suspended due to maintenance. The explanation did not match the sound. Beaumont began sketching layouts, comparing official diagrams with what he observed during patrols. What he found disturbed him deeply. The facility extended far deeper than documented. Restricted sections were not just labs. They were access points to vertical shafts descending hundreds of meters into the ice. Personnel logs showed researchers entering those areas and not reappearing for half a day. They were not working in sealed rooms, they were going underground. Pembroke uncovered more anomalies in communications. Massive encrypted data streams were being transmitted in irregular bursts to command nodes not listed in any routing tables. The volumes suggested continuous video sensor telemetry and biological monitoring data. Whatever was happening below required constant oversight from outside authorities. Over weeks, the atmosphere changed. Research staff grew more stressed. Arguments broke out in the mess hall. Medical requests increased for anxiety and sleep medication. Some researchers refused to return underground after certain shifts, citing vague safety concerns. Dr. Harriman began holding private meetings in shielded rooms where internal surveillance was disabled. That alone told me the discoveries exceeded even what command expected. Then a shipment arrived that was not on any manifest. Cargo containers were rushed directly to restricted zones, but not before I glimpsed their contents through a partially opened crate. Advanced excavation systems, biological hazard suits, sealed transport cylinders, and containers marked with symbols I recognized from weapons research programs. This equipment was meant to handle something dangerous. That night, I decided I could not remain ignorant. Years in logistics taught me every security system has blind spots. Maintenance corridors exist for efficiency, not secrecy. I tracked guard rotations, camera sweeps, and access windows until I found a narrow corridor linking logistics to a restricted zone. During a shift change I slipped through, the restricted area felt different immediately. Reinforced walls, thicker doors, heavy power cables humming with energy. The air smelled mineral, rich metallic like deep earth rather than surface ice. Following the corridor, I reached a massive shaft. Elevators descended into darkness with depth indicators marking hundreds of meters. I hid as voices approached. Researchers emerged from the lift speaking openly, thinking themselves alone. They talked about core samples showing structures extending far deeper than expected. About acoustic readings suggesting something massive and deliberately sealed. They argued over dating results showing ice layers 12,000 years old above structures far older, tens of thousands of years. One mentioned thermal anomalies, residual warmth where there should be none. Something was generating heat. They moved on and I stood frozen. This was not archaeology as we understood it. This was something ancient buried intentionally and still active. Over the following weeks, excavation accelerated. Deliveries increased. Staff fatigue worsened. Whispers spread. Something had been found. something that did not behave like a ruin. The breaking point came in our 8th week. Alarms sounded facility-wide, not fire alarms but containment alerts. Dr. Strand ordered immediate lockdown. Beaumont confirmed a containment breach in deep excavation zones and evacuation of research staff. Through corridors, I saw injured and traumatized researchers pulled from restricted sections. Lockdown lasted hours. When lifted, the facility was transformed, armed guards doubled, quarantine zones established. Emergency briefings held behind sealed doors. Pembroke showed me transmission logs from the incident, continuous live data streams sent directly to command. Rothwell documented emergency requisitions for industrial sealants, sterilization, equipment, and permanent closure materials. They were abandoning the excavation. That decision alone told me whatever happened was catastrophic. Fragments of truth emerged in whispered conversations. A sealed chamber had been opened. Interior atmosphere showed recent biological activity. Preservation systems still active. Figures inside arranged deliberately, not mummified, dormant. When systems were disturbed, some showed signs of animation. The inscriptions inside were warnings, quarantine protocols. Instructions never to open. They had not discovered ruins. They had broken a seal. Beaumont later confirmed from limited footage that the entities were humanoid but not human. Anatomical variations inconsistent with any known species. Older than modern humans, designed for long-term containment. One had shown signs of waking. The facility began sealing operations, pouring concrete into shafts, burying the discovery again. I watched history be entombed. On my final night, I stood at the perimeter staring across endless ice, knowing beneath it something remained alive, generating heat waiting. The official debrief later called it geology, territorial research. Resource assessment, lies wrapped in bureaucracy. I signed the papers. I returned to duty, but reports showed thermal anomalies persisted. The seals were holding for now. The warnings were not metaphors. They were instructions ignored. And somewhere beneath Antarctica, something ancient had been disturbed and was no longer sleeping as deeply as before. After the lockdown ended and daily operations resumed in a form that only resembled normalcy on the surface, I knew the truth could no longer be ignored or safely observed from a distance. The facility felt different in ways that were difficult to describe to anyone who had not lived inside it. The air itself seemed heavier, not physically but psychologically, as if every corridor carried the weight of something unsaid. Research staff avoided eye contact with support personnel and moved with the rigid caution of people who had seen something that refused to stay contained in memory. Security presence increased again, with patrols overlapping and access checks occurring without explanation. Even routine movements were logged and questioned. Despite this, the patterns I had been tracking did not stop. Researchers still descended underground. Power usage remained high. Thermal readings continued to fluctuate in ways that contradicted the official explanation that excavation had ceased. Whatever had happened had not ended activity below. It had changed it. Pembroke confirmed that sensor arrays were still active, though their outputs were now routed through additional encryption layers that bypassed internal monitoring. Rothwell noted concrete deliveries that exceeded what would be required to seal known shafts. Beaumont confirmed that new suppression protocols were in place for what security classified as internal escalation events. None of us needed clarification on what that meant. The decision I made next was not heroic or reckless. It was inevitable. I had spent my career supporting missions where ignorance was a liability. This was one of them. The opportunity came during a rotational focus shift, when security concentrated on monitoring research teams rather than logistics areas. Using the same maintenance access route I had identified before I moved again into restricted sections, this time I did not hesitate. The corridors were quieter than before, the hum of machinery deeper and more constant. I reached the shaft and descended alone. The elevator dropped through the ice for several minutes. Depth markers passed 200, then 300 meters. When the doors opened, I stepped into a space that erased any remaining doubt about what we were dealing with. This was not a natural cavern. This was engineered space. Tunnels cut through solid ice with precision that suggested advanced tools and deliberate planning. Support struts reinforced walls that had once been self-supporting before excavation teams arrived. Power cables ran along ceilings feeding lights and sensors that illuminated a network of corridors extending in multiple directions. I followed the primary tunnel toward the main excavation zone. The deeper I went, the warmer it became. Not warm in any comforting sense, but wrong. Surface temperatures were lethal. Down here it hovered near freezing. Something was countering the ice. As I moved forward, I noticed shapes in the walls that looked intentional. Curves, angles, and recesses that did not match drilling scars. In places, excavation had exposed darker material beneath the ice, then sealed it again hastily, as if researchers had decided some surfaces were better left covered. The main chamber opened before me without warning. It was vast, large enough to house aircraft. Scaffolding surrounded a central structure illuminated by industrial lights. I stopped at the threshold, struggling to process what I was seeing. At the heart of the chamber rose a structure that should not exist. It was not a building in any human sense. It was architecture carved from a dark material that reflected light with metallic depth. Its geometry was precise yet unsettling. Angles bent perception. Proportions created illusions of movement where there was none. The surface was etched with patterns that felt deliberate but unreadable. Symbols repeated with variations suggesting language or instruction. The structure rose like a cathedral designed by intelligence that did not share human assumptions about space or form. Towers curved inward and outward in ways that made my eyes ache. Buttresses connected at angles that seemed to contradict gravity. The longer I looked, the harder it became to judge scale or distance. It felt alive not biologically but conceptually, as if its design responded to observation. Research equipment surrounded it. Scanners mapped internal composition. Thermal sensors confirmed heat signatures originating from within. Atmospheric monitors sampled air from sealed interior chambers. Something inside was active. That realization carried more weight than fear. This was not a ruin. It was a system, and it was still functioning. I understood then why excavation had been halted abruptly. They had not reached the end, they had reached a threshold. Movement snapped me back. Researchers approached through a secondary tunnel. I retreated quickly, staying in shadow, and made my way back to the elevator before detection systems could flag my presence. The ascent felt longer than the descent. When I reached surface levels, my hands were shaking. What I had seen explained everything and raised questions that no authority could answer safely. This structure predated known human civilization by tens of thousands of years. It was buried deliberately beneath ice layers that formed after the last ice age. It was preserved, not eroded, and it was designed to endure. Over the following days, the facility entered a new phase. Sealing operations intensified. Concrete pours continued around the clock. Access points vanished. Research staff were rotated out in stages, starting with those who had spent the most time underground. Medical evaluations increased. Some personnel were flown out under sedation. Beaumont-confirmed security footage showed physiological responses in one preserved figure before evacuation. Muscle activity. Temperature increase, cellular changes. Something had begun to wake. The knowledge spread quietly among those paying attention. Ancient preservation chambers, dormant entities, quarantine protocols left by builders who understood the danger of what they contained. This was not a discovery, it was a warning ignored. The official explanation never changed. Geological anomaly, research concluded. Facility drawdown. I watched history be buried again under concrete and secrecy. On my final day, underground access was fully sealed. Thermal monitors installed after closure still showed anomalies. Subtle fluctuations suggesting activity continued despite isolation. That night, I stood alone at the edge of the facility, looking out across endless ice, knowing beneath it something endured, something patient, something that had survived ages of cold and silence, only to be disturbed by us. The thought followed me back to the surface and would not leave. We had not uncovered the past. We had stepped into a system designed to outlast us, and whatever slept beneath Antarctica had not been meant to wake in our time. The sealing operation marked the point where denial became impossible, and the facility transformed from a research outpost into a containment site operating under quiet panic. Every day after that felt like borrowed time, measured not in hours but in the distance between mistakes. The concrete pours continued without pause, and massive industrial pumps forced slurry into shafts and chambers that had taken months to excavate. Engineers worked in silence under armed supervision, treating every task like a race against something unseen. Research staff were evacuated in waves, with those who had spent the most time below leaving first, escorted by medical teams and security officers who watched them for signs of instability. Some left willingly, grateful to escape the ice and the memories beneath it. Others resisted, claiming the work was unfinished, that sealing the structure was a mistake, that whatever lay below demanded understanding, not burial. Those arguments never reached command. They died in closed rooms and classified reports. I remained behind as part of the third rotation, which meant watching the final phase of closure from the inside. The atmosphere inside Outpost Meridian grew heavier as corridors emptied and lights were shut down section by section. Common areas fell silent. The mess hall served fewer meals each day. Conversations became whispers even in spaces without surveillance. Everyone knew the facility was being erased. Beaumont spent long hours reviewing security feeds and perimeter logs, confirming that despite the concrete and barriers, thermal anomalies persisted beneath sealed zones. The readings were small fluctuations, but consistent, suggesting internal systems were still active. Pembroke confirmed from sensor data that power was still being drawn from deep below, even after official shutdown, not through cables or generators, but through residual thermal gradients that should not exist naturally. Something down there was sustaining itself. Rothwell documented final manifests, noting the volume of material used to bury the site exceeded engineering projections. They were not sealing access, they were entombing a presence. During those final days, fragments of truth surfaced in exhausted conversations among remaining researchers. One admitted the structure interior contained chambers arranged with intentional symmetry. Another described preservation alcoves designed to hold living forms in suspended states across geological time. A third spoke of inscriptions that described conditions for release, conditions never translated fully, but clearly tied to planetary cycles and environmental thresholds. They believed the builders expected eventual re-emergence, but only when the surface world met specific criteria. We had violated that timeline. The last night before my scheduled evacuation, I could not sleep. The hum beneath the floor felt stronger than before, not louder but more deliberate. I walked the perimeter alone, wrapped in cold gear, staring across endless ice, knowing beneath it something endured despite our efforts. I thought about the builders of that structure, not primitive ancestors but something parallel or preceding, intelligent, capable, patient. They had chosen Antarctica as a vault not by accident but design. Ice as insulation, isolation as protection, time as a barrier, and now that barrier was compromised. The next morning, evacuation began at dawn. A military transport arrived through blowing snow, and remaining personnel were loaded with efficiency that betrayed urgency. As the aircraft lifted, I looked down at Outpost Meridian, shrinking into white nothingness. From above, it looked insignificant. A few structures lost in ice. No sign of the chambers beneath. No hint of what was sealed there. The flight to New Zealand was silent. No one spoke about what we had seen. Debriefings began immediately upon return, conducted by officers whose expressions betrayed nothing. We were reminded of classification levels and legal consequences. Official language described geological anomalies, territorial considerations, and resource assessment. None of it matched reality. I signed non-disclosure agreements because refusal was not an option, but memory cannot be classified. In the weeks that followed, I returned to routine duty, yet found normal operations hollow. Logistics, reports, and deployment schedules felt trivial compared to the knowledge buried beneath Antarctic ice. I followed updates quietly through channels I still had access to. Thermal monitoring continued. Reports indicated persistent heat signatures under sealed zones, minor but stable. Analysts debated whether it was residual energy or something adaptive. The concern was not if the seals would fail, but when. The builders' warnings replayed in my mind: quarantine protocols, preservation conditions, deliberate delay. We had not destroyed what they sealed. We had only postponed it again, and unlike them, we did not understand the full consequences. At night, I dreamed of the structure, not images but sensations, angles that refused to resolve, spaces that shifted when observed. A sense of being watched not by eyes but by awareness older than language. I do not claim it reached out or called to me, only that it persisted, waiting as it always had. Time meant nothing to it. Ice and concrete were inconveniences. The operation at Outpost Meridian was classified as concluded, but nothing was resolved. Something ancient remained active beneath the ice, responding to disturbance, adapting, perhaps learning. And I knew with certainty that sealing it again had not ended the story. It had only delayed the moment when the surface world would have to face what had been hidden for longer than recorded history. Returning to routine duty should have grounded me, but instead it sharpened everything I could no longer ignore. Life resumed its expected shape on paper. Briefing schedules, inventory reports, and quiet mornings that felt artificial after the isolation of Antarctica. Outpost Meridian officially no longer existed. Its designation was removed from active listings, and references to it vanished from shared systems. To anyone without the right clearance, it was as if the facility had never been there. That erasure was deliberate and thorough, yet it could not touch what had already settled into my thoughts. I carried the memory of the structure with me, not as images, but as a sense of scale and intent that no normal architecture had ever conveyed. I found myself measuring everything against it. Buildings, roads, bases, even cities felt temporary by comparison. The builders beneath the ice had worked in a different relationship with time. They had planned not for generations but for epochs. That realization followed me into every conversation and every quiet moment. Debriefings continued for weeks. Each session repeated the same sanitized narrative about geological anomalies and strategic resource evaluation. The officers delivering these briefings never asked what I thought. They asked only if I understood the legal consequences of disclosure. I said yes because that was expected. I signed documents acknowledging that everything I witnessed was classified under national security statutes. I complied outwardly while keeping my own internal record intact. I knew others were doing the same. I saw it in the eyes of those who had served at Meridian and returned scattered across different postings. We never spoke directly about it, but recognition passed silently between us. An understanding that something had been buried that should never have been disturbed, and that the act of sealing it again had not restored balance. I monitored classified channels when possible, looking for references to Antarctic thermal monitoring. Reports continued quietly. Heat signatures remained stable beneath sealed zones. Analysts debated explanations ranging from geothermal anomalies to residual mechanical activity. None addressed the obvious conclusion. Something inside that structure was still functioning. I began to wonder whether the builders had anticipated intrusion, whether their preservation systems were adaptive rather than passive, whether the disturbance had triggered responses designed to persist through containment. Those thoughts were not paranoia. They were logical extensions of what we had observed. The entities in the chambers had not been dead. They had been dormant. That distinction mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. At night, my sleep fractured. Dreams returned me to the chamber, not visually but spatially. I felt its presence as a vast enclosed awareness pressing against boundaries. Not hostile, not benevolent, simply enduring. I woke with the sense that time was moving differently somewhere far away beneath ice and concrete. Months passed. Life continued. Jennifer noticed changes I could not hide. The quiet vigilance, the way I listened for sounds that did not exist. She asked once if Antarctica had been harder than combat zones. I told her yes and no. Harder because the enemy had no face and no name. Harder because it was older than fear. I could not explain more. She accepted that answer with the same silence she had given my departure. One evening, a secure message crossed my terminal flagged with priority routing that bypassed normal channels. It referenced updated Antarctic monitoring data and requested logistical review. The language was careful, but the implication was clear. Thermal readings beneath the sealed site had changed, not increased dramatically but shifted pattern. The fluctuations suggested internal reorganization rather than decay. Something was adjusting. The analysts did not say it aloud, but they did not have to. Systems that shut down fade. Systems that adapt change. I submitted the requested review using neutral language while understanding what it meant. The seals were holding, but the environment inside was not static. The builders had designed something resilient. I thought about the inscriptions researchers had mentioned: warnings not to open, conditions for release. Those conditions had never been fully translated. We had assumed they were symbolic or ceremonial. What if they were precise? What if the builders understood planetary cycles, climate thresholds, and biological readiness far beyond our models? Antarctica was warming. Ice patterns were shifting. Human activity was accelerating change across the globe. Perhaps the conditions they warned about were not ancient history but future inevitability. That thought unsettled me more than anything else. The structure had been placed beneath ice not just to hide it, but to monitor the world above. Heat generation within suggested internal power sources that could last millennia. Preservation systems implied long-term observation, not abandonment. They had not buried their creation and walked away. They had put it to sleep with the expectation that one day it would wake. The question was whether that awakening was meant to be controlled or whether it would be catastrophic by design. I revisited every fragment of conversation I had overheard. The researchers who spoke of quarantine protocols and sealed chambers, the inscriptions warning of premature access, the deliberate arrangement of entities within preservation alcoves. It felt less like a tomb and more like a vault containing something too dangerous to release without preparation. We had not prepared. We had stumbled into it driven by curiosity and strategic advantage. In doing so, we may have initiated a process we could not reverse. The world moved on unaware. News cycles shifted. Conflicts rose and fell. None of it acknowledged what lay beneath Antarctic ice. Yet I sensed a clock had started, not one measured in days or years, but in environmental change and human expansion. The builders had waited through ice ages. They could wait longer. I wondered if the warmth beneath the ice was not merely residual but communicative, a signal of readiness, a response to disturbance. The thought followed me everywhere. I did not share it with anyone because there was no language for it that would not sound like madness. But it was not madness. It was pattern recognition born of experience, and it told me that sealing Outpost Meridian had not ended anything. It had merely closed our eyes while something ancient remained awake in the dark, learning about the world that had found it too early. Years passed after Antarctica, yet the weight of what I carried never faded, and instead settled deeper, becoming part of how I saw the world and my place within it. I remained in service, moving through assignments that on paper looked important and demanding, but in truth felt small compared to the knowledge that something ancient and intelligent lay sealed beneath ice and concrete, waiting with patience measured in ages rather than lifetimes. Officially, the operation at Outpost Meridian was closed and classified. Unofficially, it never truly ended. Monitoring continued through layers of bureaucracy and compartmentalization, so dense that even senior officers rarely grasped the full picture. Through my position in logistics, I occasionally glimpsed fragments of that hidden effort. Specialized equipment routed to Antarctic monitoring stations under different designations, funding lines that reappeared under new project names. Sensor data requests framed as climate research, but tagged with security clearances far above what environmental science required. Each fragment confirmed the same truth. Whatever lay beneath the ice was still active enough to justify constant observation. I learned to read between lines of sanitized reports. Small language shifts mattered. When analysts wrote persistent thermal anomaly rather than residual heat, they acknowledged continuity rather than decay. When they referenced adaptive variance, they admitted the system beneath the ice was changing. When they added contingency language to otherwise routine monitoring plans, it meant someone, somewhere was worried about escalation. I watched those patterns accumulate over time, forming a quiet narrative that contradicted every official reassurance. At home, life moved forward. Jennifer and I adjusted to a version of normal that included my silences and my sudden moments of distant focus. I became hyper-aware of environmental reports, global temperature trends, polar ice data. News about Antarctica drew my attention in ways I could not explain without sounding unhinged. When scientists spoke publicly about warming trends and subglacial lakes forming beneath ice sheets, I listened not as a civilian, but as someone who knew what else lay down there. I wondered whether the builders had chosen Antarctica because it was stable once locked in ice, or because they understood it would not remain frozen forever. Perhaps the melting itself was part of the timeline. Perhaps the preservation systems were designed to respond to environmental thresholds rather than fixed dates. That idea troubled me more than the existence of the structure itself. If the awakening conditions were planetary rather than human, then no amount of secrecy or concrete could prevent what came next. I began to notice subtle changes in how the subject was discussed within classified circles. Early reports focused on containment integrity and structural stability. Later ones referenced behavioral modeling and response forecasting. That shift mattered. You do not model behavior for inanimate objects. You do not forecast responses for ruins. Someone somewhere believed the system beneath the ice was capable of action. That belief was never stated openly, but it shaped planning decisions and funding priorities. Beaumont and I crossed paths once years later at a base neither of us had expected to be assigned to. We did not speak directly about Antarctica, but our conversation hovered around it like gravity. He mentioned ongoing monitoring in passing, and the way command language had changed from preservation to readiness. He did not elaborate because he did not have to. We both understood what that implied. Rothwell retired early, citing health reasons. Pembroke disappeared into a research division that officially did not exist. Those of us who had been there were scattered deliberately. Separation reduced risk. But memory remained a shared burden even when unspoken. At night, I still dreamed of the structure not as a place but as an idea, a presence defined by geometry and patience. In those dreams, it did not move or speak. It simply waited while the world above changed around it, ice thinning, temperatures rising, human activity increasing, all variables the builders may have anticipated. I began to question the assumption that the entities within were dangerous by nature. Dangerous to whom? Perhaps they were sealed not because they were hostile, but because their existence would destabilize a younger species not ready to confront them. Quarantine does not always mean evil. Sometimes it means timing. That thought conflicted with the fear-driven response I had witnessed at Meridian, but fear does not always equal truth. It equals lack of understanding. The researchers had panicked because something began to wake, not because it attacked, but because it violated expectations. Waking alone was enough to trigger evacuation. That distinction mattered to me. Still, the warnings carved into the structure were real. They had not been subtle. They spoke of conditions and seals and consequences. The builders understood risk. They had invested immense effort into preservation and delay. That suggested foresight and restraint rather than aggression. I wondered if by interfering we had placed ourselves on the wrong side of that restraint. The world continued toward the conditions the builders might have predicted. Ice loss accelerated, Antarctic melt increased, political interest in polar regions intensified. Every new drilling proposal, every research initiative, every territorial claim felt like another step closer to re-exposure. I knew with certainty that if the structure were discovered again openly, the response would be worse than before. Curiosity would outweigh caution. Exploitation would follow discovery. Whatever patience the builders had might finally run out. The idea that humanity could trigger its own reckoning through ignorance weighed on me heavily. I began documenting my memories privately, not for publication, but for coherence. Writing helped organize thoughts that otherwise circled endlessly. I avoided speculation and focused on observation. The facts alone were unsettling enough. Ancient architecture beneath Antarctic ice, preservation systems maintaining biological dormancy across geological time. Heat generation without external fuel, warnings about premature access, sealing operations that failed to extinguish activity, persistent monitoring suggesting ongoing adaptation. Those facts required no embellishment. They stood on their own as evidence that human history was incomplete and that our timeline was not the only one that mattered. I did not know what would happen next or when. I only knew that sealing the site again had not restored ignorance. Knowledge once gained cannot be buried as easily as concrete. Somewhere beneath Antarctica, something remained aware, in its own way, responding slowly to a world that was finally approaching the conditions it had been built to endure. And I feared that when the time came, humanity would not be ready to face the consequences of disturbing something that had waited so long to be left alone. I am telling this now not because I expect belief or understanding, but because silence has a way of turning truth into something heavier than fear, and I have carried that weight long enough. Years after my return from Antarctica, I read a classified summary that confirmed what I had suspected since the sealing operation ended. Thermal activity beneath the ice had not diminished, it had stabilized. That single word changed everything. Stabilization implies equilibrium, not decay. It means a system has adjusted to new conditions and found balance. Whatever lay beneath the ice had not been smothered by concrete or crushed by pressure. It had adapted. The report framed this as a curiosity of geothermal variance, but the analysts added modeling projections and contingency language that betrayed their real concern. They were no longer asking whether the structure could remain sealed. They were asking how long it would remain compliant. That distinction haunted me. Compliance implies agency. It suggests the system beneath the ice was choosing restraint rather than being forced into it. I thought about the warnings carved into the structure. They were not emotional or symbolic. They were procedural, instructions left by a civilization that understood long timelines and the danger of impatience. Those builders had not destroyed what they feared. They had preserved it under conditions they believed would keep the world safe until the right moment. That moment was never meant to be ours. Yet we had forced contact through drilling and excavation, and in doing so may have signaled that the surface world had reached a stage worth observing. I realized then that the greatest mistake was not the discovery, but the assumption of ownership. We treated the structure as something to be claimed, studied, controlled. We never considered that it might be watching us in return. The idea that something older than recorded history could possess awareness unsettles modern minds, but nothing I witnessed suggested unconscious machinery. The architecture itself conveyed intent. The preservation systems implied care and foresight. The entities within were arranged not randomly, but deliberately. That arrangement carried meaning even if we could not decipher it. In my quieter moments, I questioned whether the builders were truly gone or simply elsewhere. Perhaps the structure was not a tomb, but a relay, a message left for the future encoded in stone and silence. If so, then, our intrusion may have been interpreted not as threat, but as confirmation that the world above had reached a certain threshold. That thought terrified me more than the idea of hostile awakening. Because it suggested inevitability, over time my certainty grew that the seals were never meant to last forever. They were meant to buy time, time for ice to form, time for climates to shift, time for species to rise and fall, time for conditions to align. The builders had chosen Antarctica because it was remote, stable, and indifferent to human ambition. They could not have predicted us specifically, but they understood patterns. They understood that intelligence eventually digs and probes and seeks advantage. They designed their preservation to endure that curiosity until the world itself changed enough to make awakening either safe or unavoidable. We were not the first to stand at the edge of that decision. We were simply the loudest. In the years since, I have watched global changes accelerate, ice retreat, ocean levels rise, weather patterns destabilize. Human technology spreads into every corner of the planet. Each development feels like another variable moving toward a condition the builders may have anticipated. I do not believe whatever lies beneath the ice is evil in any simple sense. Evil implies intent toward harm. What I sensed was something beyond that. Indifference, perhaps, or purpose misaligned with ours. The danger does not come from malice but from incompatibility, two timelines intersecting, two intelligences shaped by radically different histories. That intersection rarely ends peacefully. I have also considered the possibility that the builders sealed themselves away rather than something separate, that the entities preserved were not prisoners but caretakers, that they chose dormancy to survive planetary catastrophe or cosmic cycles we barely comprehend. If so, then, our disturbance may have been a summons rather than a breach. That possibility keeps me awake more than any nightmare, because it suggests they are not waiting to escape but waiting to resume. Resume what? I cannot say, but the structure beneath the ice was not defensive in design. It was preservative. It did not radiate hostility, it radiated endurance. That endurance is what frightens me most. Human civilizations rise and collapse within a fraction of the time those systems have already waited. We measure history in centuries, they measured it in ice ages. The reports I read toward the end of my access spoke of scenario planning and public narrative control. That meant contingency for disclosure. Someone somewhere understood that the truth might surface whether they wanted it to or not. Ice melts, satellites improve, curiosity spreads. Secrets buried in Antarctica are not buried forever. I do not know if the awakening will be sudden or gradual. I suspect it will be subtle. Changes mistaken for natural processes, signals dismissed as noise, systems adjusting quietly until the surface world notices too late that something beneath it has been active all along. When that moment comes, I fear humanity will respond as it always does, with fear and force, and that response may be exactly what the builders tried to prevent by sealing themselves away in the first place. I tell this story now because I believe the greatest danger is not what lies beneath the ice, but our inability to accept that we are not the first or the most important intelligence this planet has hosted. We treat the unknown as something to conquer rather than something to understand. The structure beneath Antarctica challenges that instinct. It asks a question we are not prepared to answer. What do you do when you are no longer alone in your own history? I do not claim certainty about what will happen. I only know what I saw and what the data continues to suggest. Something ancient remains active beneath the ice, something patient and resilient, something that endured long before us and may endure long after. The warnings carved into that structure were not threats, they were guidance, and we ignored them. When the ice finally gives way and the world above meets the conditions the builders anticipated, there will be no undoing what was set in motion. The past we buried will rise not as myth or legend, but as reality. And when it does, we will have to confront the truth that our understanding of this world has always been incomplete. That is why I am speaking now. Not to warn of monsters, but to warn of arrogance. Because whatever waits beneath Antarctica was not hidden out of fear of us. It was hidden out of patience. And patience is something humanity has never truly understood. If this account stayed with you, then do not dismiss it too quickly, because some truths sound unreal only until time proves them otherwise. What was buried beneath the ice was not just history, but a warning written for those willing to listen. If you want to hear more stories like this told without filters or comfort, then stay with this channel. Subscribe now and keep your eyes open, because some secrets are not meant to stay frozen forever.